Have you ever wondered whether an unassuming love story tucked away in the Old Testament might conceal ancient clues about God's grand design for humanity? Welcome to Yeshua, the channel that dares to probe the hidden layers of biblical narratives, unveiling secrets that many have overlooked. Today, we delve into the Book of Ruth, a tale that seems almost quaint at first glance. A daughter-in-law pledging loyalty to her grieving mother-in-law, gleaning leftover grains in a stranger's field, and ultimately finding redemption in a culture far removed from our modern age. But beneath the simple scenes lies a tapestry woven with conspiratorial depth, cosmic hints of a lineage leading to kings, and even to the Messiah. So take a journey with us, and let your imagination wander back to the era of the Judges, when everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges 21:25. And see how a Moabite woman's faith and courage might hold the key to far more than just her personal destiny. First, consider the setting. The land of Israel was steeped in turmoil. The time of the Judges was marked by cyclical rebellion against God, followed by oppression, then deliverance, only to spiral back into moral decline. According to tradition, famine in Bethlehem, ironically, the house of bread, drives a family to seek sustenance in Moab. This is no trivial relocation. The Moabites, traceable to the offspring of Lot, Genesis 19:37, had historically tangled with Israel, sometimes violently. Israelite law carried particular warnings against Moab. Deuteronomy 23:3, barring them from the assembly of the Lord up to the 10th generation. Why then would Elimelech and Naomi make a home among their ancestral foes? Desperation reveals itself as a great equalizer, but it also opens the stage for a bigger question. Could there be an true or not? These rabbinic musings underline the tension inherent in Moab's legacy, an uneasy alliance of hostility and potential redemption. That tension is incarnate in the Book of Ruth, where the possibility of outsiders becoming part of God's story stands in sharp relief against the normal prejudice of the time. Elimelech and Naomi settle in Moab with their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, who marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Then, a series of tragedies unravels. Elimelech dies, followed by both sons. Naomi is left bereft. She hears that Bethlehem's famine has ceased, so she resolves to return. Yet, under the patriarchal culture of the time, a childless widow had few prospects. Naomi, convinced of her own emptiness, urges Orpah and Ruth to remain in Moab, to remarry in their own land, to hope for a future without the bitter baggage Naomi carries. In a scene pulsing with raw emotion, Orpah weeps and eventually departs, returning to her own people. But Ruth clings to Naomi in an oath that reverberates through the ages. "Do not urge me to leave you," she proclaims, "for wherever you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Ruth 1:16. This is more than sentimental attachment. Some interpret Ruth's pledge as a radical conversion, a Moabite woman pledging herself to the Israelite God, who, by Israelite law, had seemingly barred Moabites from the congregation. Yet, here she stands, stepping over every legal boundary, vowing to unite her fate with Naomi. Conspiracy-minded theologians might ask, was there something about Naomi's faith that Ruth found irresistibly alluring? even amid tragedy? Or did God plant in Ruth's soul a mysterious awareness that her life carried a larger significance than Moabite tradition could ever satisfy? They journeyed to Bethlehem, arriving in time for the barley harvest. The women's return likely stirred local gossip. Naomi, whose name means pleasant, now insists she be called Mara, meaning bitter, for she feels God has dealt harshly with her. Though the text doesn't describe the scene in graphic detail, we can imagine the hush that fell over Bethlehem's narrow streets. Townswomen gather around Naomi, their eyes sliding to the foreigner at her side. In that era, Moabites were suspect at best. Would the community welcome Ruth, or would they whisper behind her back? Undaunted, Ruth assumes responsibility to provide for Naomi. She asks permission to glean in the fields, gathering the scraps left by harvesters. Gleaning is more than manual labor. It's a provision mandated by the law in Leviticus 23:22, ensuring the poor and foreigners aren't forgotten. Ruth's willingness to toil under the sun reveals more about her character than any formal testimony. She is humble, determined, and loyal, qualities that quickly catch the eye of Boaz, the owner of the field. He inquires about this Moabite woman gleaning so diligently. A hush might descend as the harvesters explain. She is Naomi's daughter-in-law, the one who forsook her homeland to care for her mother-in-law. Boaz's response is immediate compassion. He invites her to glean freely, warns the young men not to harm or harass her, and even offers water drawn from his workers' vessels. At first glance, Boaz's kindness seems purely altruistic. Some suspect a hidden motive, but the text suggests a sincerity born from deep roots of faith. After all, Boaz greets his harvesters with, "The Lord be with you," Ruth 2:4, implying a piety that extends to everyday work. Could Boaz sense that Ruth's presence wasn't mere happenstance, but part of a divine tapestry? Whether by rumor or by divine nudge, he recognizes Ruth's virtue and commitment. In a time when moral chaos ran rampant in Israel, exemplified by the era of Judges, Boaz stands out like a steady rock of righteousness. The Talmud sometimes describes Boaz as one of the righteous judges in his generation, though tradition varies on exact details. In any case, his integrity shines, and soon his path and Ruth's become entwined in a way that neither of them could have predicted. When Ruth returns home, laden with grain far beyond what a lone gleaner should normally acquire, Naomi's eyes widen. She discerns God's hand at work. The man who showed such favor to Ruth is none other than Boaz, a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. Ruth 2:20. This phrase, kinsman redeemer, or goel, taps into a rich cultural practice. According to Israelite custom, a kinsman redeemer could buy back family land sold under economic duress, preserve the family lineage, and in some cases marry a widow to raise offspring in her deceased husband's name. Leviticus 25. Deuteronomy 25. 10. So far from random good fortune, Ruth's gleaning in Boaz's field might point to something orchestrated. Some conspiratorial readings of Ruth see this arrangement as more than a family convenience. Perhaps God was aligning genealogical threads leading to the royal line of King David, and ultimately to the Messiah. Indeed, Matthew 1:5 features Ruth by name in Jesus' lineage, a blatant sign that the Redeemer of the world would descend from a Moabite convert. Naomi's heart once bitter, ignites with hope. She plans a daring act. She tells Ruth to wash perfume. To modern ears, this might sound scandalous. Even to ancient listeners, it's a highly vulnerable, borderline provocative gesture. Ruth's act isn't mere seduction. It's a plea for protection under Boaz's mantle. In ancient Hebrew culture, the act of covering someone with one's garment signified a pledge of provision and betrothal. Ruth's whispered request, "Spread your covering over your servant," is essentially a marriage proposal. And not just any marriage, but one rooted in the concept of redemption. Why the secrecy under the stars? Some say Naomi wanted to avoid public speculation or shame upon Boaz should he decline. Others see symbolic undertones, reminiscent of how God spreads his wings over his people. Ezekiel 16:8. This nighttime encounter thrums with tension. Will Boaz reject Ruth, citing her Moabite heritage or the impropriety of such an approach? But Boaz reacts with admiration. He calls her a worthy woman, Ruth 3:11, praising her for not chasing after younger men. In an age where moral lines blurred, Boaz's response illuminates a tapestry of honor. He promises to fulfill the role of redeemer if a closer relative declines, but he insists on handling the matter righteously. Nothing about this is clandestine or morally gray. It's deeply intimate yet grounded in cultural and spiritual tradition. Dawn breaks, and Ruth leaves quietly. Carrying 6 together, they anticipate the city gate confrontation, where legal matters were settled in public view. At this point, the story shifts to a daylight scene at Bethlehem's city gate. Ancient city gates weren't just passageways. They were the courts of justice, the place for binding agreements, witnessed by elders. Boaz waits there for the closer relative, a man who legally has the first right to redeem Naomi's land and marry Ruth. Initially, this unnamed relative is eager to expand his property holdings, but upon hearing that acquiring the land also entails marrying Ruth to raise children in her deceased husband's name, he withdraws. Possibly he feared complicating his own inheritance, or he balked at the stigma of marrying a Moabite. Either way, he yields his right to Boaz. The transaction is sealed in the custom of the time, exchanging a sandal, a seemingly odd gesture to modern readers, but deeply symbolic to them. Removing one's sandal signified passing the rite of redemption. And just like that, Boaz publicly commits to redeeming Ruth and Naomi's lineage, bridging a bitter past to a hopeful future. The final verses of Ruth read like a triumph. Boaz takes Ruth as his wife. She bears a son named Obed, who becomes the grandfather of King David, forging a direct link to the genealogical line of Israel's greatest monarch. Naomi, who once insisted on being called bitter, now holds a grandchild in her arms, and the community women celebrate that God has not left her without a redeemer. The same God who allowed famine and loss orchestrated a legacy that would shape an entire nation, and eventually all nations, through the birth of Jesus. Scholars have long marveled at this unexpected inclusion of a Moabite woman into the line of the Messiah. In Matthew's Gospel, Ruth stands alongside Rahab, another foreigner, to highlight that God's story transcends ethnic boundaries, a subtle subversion in a world often obsessed with lineage purity. Some conspiratorial readings suggest that certain religious leaders, over time, might have downplayed Ruth's Moabite roots, nervous about tarnishing Israel's proud heritage. Yet, the Book of Ruth remains unabashed, preserving this subversive truth. Though the Book of Ruth itself isn't among the largest scrolls discovered, the cultural milieu of the Dead Sea Scroll community resonates with the notion of a faithful remnant expectantly awaiting a redeemer. In this sense, Ruth's story foreshadows the expansion of God's people beyond Israel's borders, setting a prophetic tone that resonates throughout Scripture. Yet, it would be a mistake to reduce Ruth to a mere genealogical stepping stone. Her radical kindness, devotion, and faiths speak volumes about how ordinary acts can ripple through eternity. She never preaches from a mountaintop. She simply pledges loyalty and diligently gathers grain. In her darkest hour, she holds on to Naomi's God despite every reason not to. By that simple but profound faith, she transforms her fate and Naomi's. Similarly, Boaz doesn't stage an epic revolt. He quietly demonstrates integrity by respecting Ruth's vulnerability, fulfilling legal obligations, and showing extraordinary generosity. Their story, devoid of overt miracles or parting seas, stands as a beacon that God often works in the mundane, hidden corners of our daily lives. As we read Ruth, we can't ignore the personal implication. Many of us have faced times of famine, maybe not literal starvation, but spiritual or emotional dryness. We may have been exiled to figurative Moabs, places of pain or isolation, wondering if God notices our struggle. The story of Ruth dares to insist that hidden behind hardship, a benevolent presence weaves silver threads of redemption. Could it be that every field we glean in, every door that opens unexpectedly, is part of a divine orchestration? Could it be that our most challenging relationships are forging a deeper capacity for loyalty and love that will shape not only our destiny, but perhaps that of generations to come? We also wrestle with questions about who is truly in or out in God's plan. In this narrative, a Moabite woman is fully in. The underlying message about outsiders being welcomed has echoes in countless other biblical stories. Rahab in Jericho, the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8, and ultimately Jesus' open-armed invitation to Gentiles. If Ruth's vow to Naomi, "Your God will be my God," unlocks for her a new inheritance, might that ring a bell for anyone who longs to attach themselves to God's people, regardless of background or past labels? A conspiratorial note arises here. Some have suggested that the Book of Ruth was included in the Hebrew canon, precisely to highlight that the Messiah's lineage wasn't as purely Israelite as certain zealots might have wanted to believe. It stands as a subtle yet profound protest against exclusionary mindsets. This might be why, in Jewish tradition, the Book of Ruth is read at Pentecost, Shavuot, the festival commemorating the giving of the law, reminding the community that the covenant extends beyond just one people group. And in the Christian faith, the birth of Christ, who claims Ruth as an ancestor, drives home the point that God's love and plan encompass all who, like Ruth, will say, "Ye yes," to his invitation. We see, too, how generational pain can be redeemed. Naomi's bitterness, shaped by the death of her husband and sons, could have suffocated her spirit permanently. Yet through Ruth's faithfulness and Boaz's kindness, Naomi's life was revived. The once empty arms are filled again. The once hopeless heart finds solace. One might reflect on personal times of bitterness. Where was God in that season? Ruth assures us that even when despair clouds our vision, we can cling to the possibility that redemption is just around the corner, often in unexpected form. Like a hidden plot twist, God's hand can flip our stories from sorrow to joy, though rarely on our preferred timeline. Another vital dimension is the power of silent faith. No burning bush or parted Red Sea punctuates Ruth's journey. Instead, we observe gleaning, daily chores, hushed conversations at twilight. These are not lesser acts of devotion. They are the ordinary channels where the extraordinary emerges. Perhaps it's a reminder that in our own routines, punching in at a dull job, caring for loved ones, greeting strangers with kindness, God might be orchestrating threads we cannot see. Ruth's story validates those small steps of integrity that can culminate in seismic transformation. As we come to the close of this drama, the genealogical note is too important to overlook. The Book of Ruth ends by stating, Od fathered Jesse, who fathered David, and from David's lineage arises the promised Messiah. How startling that the same King of Kings who parted seas and spoke galaxies into being would choose to embed his plan in a quiet love story. Yet that's precisely the message. The unstoppable purpose of God, rippling through centuries, can rest upon the selfless act of gleaning or a late-night proposal at a threshing floor. The cosmic significance is embedded in the personal. This invites us to ask how our own seemingly mundane choices might help shape futures. In reflecting on this, you might wonder, are there parallels in your life where bitterness threatens to eclipse hope? Are you gleaning in fields that seem unremarkable, or toiling through tasks that feel as Naomi this resonates with a conspiratorial perspective, might highlight the subversive theme that a Moabite lineage is at the root of Israel's greatest king. The same Bethlehem that once turned its back on Naomi and Ruth would become the birthplace of David and later the Messiah. These circles of meaning are so intricate that one cannot help but wonder if the entire narrative was meant to reveal that God's planning extends far beyond what humans anticipate. The phrase, unseen hand, has never rung truer. If you take a moment, you might sense that in your own life, the unseen hand is at work, orchestrating encounters and opportunities, if you're willing to glean in unexpected fields. So how do we apply these lessons today? For one, loyalty matters. Ruth's willingness to stand by Naomi, though it offered no immediate benefit, became the pivot for her destiny. In a world teeming with transactional relationships, this story challenges us to invest in people with no guarantee of as we do, we may find ourselves, like Ruth, gleaning divine favor and forging unexpected bonds that rewrite our future. Second, integrity in the quiet places matters. Boaz's faithfulness, humility, and kindness shaped the course of biblical history without flashy miracles or fanfare. Our small acts of empathy, generosity, and ethical vigilance can reverberate beyond our lifetime. But perhaps the greatest takeaway is that none of us are too far from redemption. Naomi felt forsaken, convinced the Almighty had turned against her, only to discover that the very bitterness she hated opened the door. This book is a beacon of second chances and fresh beginning. It stands as a voice of hope for anyone who has felt marginalized, disqualified, or broken by life's losses. Step into that final scene in your mind's eye. Naomi, cradling little Obed, neighbors gathered around praising God for restoring her joy. Ruth stands beside Boaz, fully integrated into the community once foreign to her. The morning sun rises over Bethlehem's fields, where barley once lay in neat piles, no trace of the sorrow that started this journey. Yet beneath this tranquil tableau, heaven hums with the knowledge that these events lay the groundwork for Israel's monarchy and centuries later, a more profound salvation. Like puzzle pieces snapping into place, we recognize that God's mosaic is large, far larger than our single viewpoint. If the story had ended with Naomi's widowhood and Ruth's anonymity in Moab, none would guess the magnitude of what was lost. But thanks to Ruth's courageous choice, what was lost becomes found, and a future king's lineage is secured. Let us not forget that the Book of Ruth was written and preserved in a world suspicious of foreigners, prone to tribal loyalties. This narrative stands out like a rebellious anthem, proclaiming that God's plan is bigger than petty boundaries. That is the subversive heart of Ruth. It is a drama of inclusion, redemption, and unstoppable grace. Even a famine, tragic deaths, or cultural hostility cannot silence God's unwavering intent to draw outsiders into the fold. In a modern context, where divisions still plague societies, Ruth remains a potent challenge. Where might we lay aside prejudice and extend a welcoming hand, not knowing the hidden ways God might be knitting that gesture into his cosmic plan? It is fitting that many centuries after Ruth gleaned in Bethlehem, shepherds there would receive the first announcement of Jesus' birth. Luke 2, 8-11. The link between humble laborers and redemptive news continues, reinforcing that God appears in lowly, unexpected places. That pattern is a consistent hallmark of the divine narrative. Hidden beginnings leading to glorious conclusion. Ruth, once an impoverished widow scrounging for leftover barley, becomes the great-grandmother of Israel's beloved king and an ancestor of Jesus Christ, the King of Kings. Talk about a story that demolishes cynicism. If God can do that through a Moabite gleaner, might he not also be able to rewrite your story's ending? As we draw these threads together, remember that Ruth's story does not merely comfort us with a happy ending. It provokes us to examine our own lives. Are we loyal like Ruth, or do we cling only to what is convenient? Are we as steadfast in integrity as Boaz, or do we compromise when tested? Do we, like Naomi, occasionally allow bitterness to blind us from the possibility of a new dawn? The Book of Ruth is not just ancient history. It is a mirror reflecting universal human experiences, pain, loss, hope, love, and asserting that if we remain faithful in the fields assigned to us, we might just stumble into a redemption greater than we ever imagined. If you find yourself in a season of famine or heartbreak, glean hope from Ruth. Redemption might be nearer than you think, though it may arrive by winding roads and nocturnal threshing floors. If you identify with Boaz, ask yourself whether you are using your position and resources to shelter and uplift those on the margin. And if you're like Naomi, weighed down by sorrow, consider that each step you take might be leading you back into a Bethlehem season of renewal, where joy can be restored in surprising ways. That's the power of this 4-chapter scroll. It subverts our expectations, challenges our boundaries, and exalts the unremarkable with cosmic significance. It dares to say that a Moabite widow's decisions matter on the grand stage of history, and that a faithful landowner's everyday kindness can echo into generations yet to be born. Could there be a more poignant reminder that none of our actions, no matter how ordinary, is wasted in God's economy? We here at Yeshua encourage you to let the Book of Ruth, as you contemplate the conspiratorial wonder of how a forbidden Moabite enters the bloodstream of Israel's highest line, you might just sense the pulse of a divine plan that continually breaks down the walls we humans construct. Let the hush of Bethlehem's fields settle over you, whispering that your daily choices, your quiet faithfulness, can carry consequences of eternal significance. In closing, consider Naomi's final testimony. She who returned home bitter found arms full of new life. The neighbors around her celebrated, proclaiming that God had restored her. The same God still works today, weaving your struggles into a broader tapestry if you let him. So, as you turn off this video, let your next steps embody the spirit of Ruth's pledge. Choose loyalty, compassion, and faith. Glean in the fields of opportunity with humility and diligence. Dare to trust that in your everyday acts, a hidden Redeemer might be preparing something far beyond your understanding. And when whispers of doubt ask if your story can truly matter, recall this unlikely Moabite girl gleaning handfuls of grain in a foreign land, and realize that sometimes the simplest acts of devotion become the gateway to history-shaking redemption. May Ruth's legacy inspire you to uncover the divine threads in your own journey, reminding you that no family background, no devastating loss, and no geographical boundary can thwart the plan of the God who yearns to shelter you under his wing. And that is the quiet but profound invitation of this ancient tale. Stand in awe of the Redeemer who sees beyond your limitations, weaving your life into his grand design, just as he did for Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. Indeed, the God who orchestrated a royal lineage out of famine and widowhood still reigns, capable of writing a fresh story for you and for all who, like Ruth, boldly say, "I will go where you go, and your God shall be my God." Let that promise echo, and may you find comfort in knowing that your field of gleaning might yet become the birthplace of blessings beyond measure. Shalom, and thank you for journeying with us here at Yeshua. May the ancient fields of Bethlehem inspire you to trust, to hope, and to embrace the infinite possibilities hidden in every step of faith.